thank you very much, and it's a huge pleasure to be here with you tonight at the Cardiff Business Club. In the way of these things, just a few preliminaries. I was also going to say something for just a few minutes about my college affiliation, Jesus College, which for those of you who don't know is the Welsh College in Oxford, and say something about why we're excited about what we're doing with our Welsh access work before I launch into a discussion around our future in the digital age. I'd like to say thank you also to Brooks MacDonald for supporting this evening, and it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm the principal of this Welsh college. I'm supremely unqualified, of course, because I'm not Welsh, and I'm a computer scientist, and I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. I came from a working class family, and my father was a policeman, a village bobby in a small village in the Peak District, and I went on to university. I was fortunate to go to university and do my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees at the expense of the state. And I was extraordinarily fortunate, I think, to benefit from a level of social mobility that is still profoundly important and not always available in a world where student fees and tuition is what it is. The Welsh pursue an extremely enlightened view on this. You allow your students to use their discounted tuition, their £3,000 required tuition fee, to spend that in United Kingdom universities. And that allows for the opportunity for your brightest students, for your people, to go to higher education wherever they so choose. And if they choose to come to Oxford, we're delighted to have them, I have to say. And we've been working very hard on a program we call the Seren Initiative. The Seren Initiative, very much born of a recognition that the historic link between Welsh schools and the universities of England and Wales and Scotland were there to be preserved and enhanced. And so the Seren School is about giving students a sense that they have the means, if they have the ability, there is a place for them at any of the elite institutions. Now, we'd love them to come to Oxford, and we'd love them to come to Jesus. And to that end, we support a summer school. 75 students last year came to Jesus for a week at our expense to understand the opportunities that higher education can afford. And I'm delighted to say the conversion rate of those 75 students who came, 48 of them went on to apply to Oxford and Cambridge and others to elite universities, and that's an extraordinary achievement. I think it's important to see that we've always, in Jesus College, had this extraordinary exchange of human talent between the Principality and England. The flow of talent is two-way, and I think it's hugely important in the age in which we live that we continue to recognize that fundamental mobility and importance of our islands. We've also, I have to say, just closed on something very precious to us, the full endowment of the Jesus Chair of Celtic, which is the single chair in the United Kingdom, very old and established, dedicated to studying the Celtic language. Now, people would say in an age of AI, does Celtic matter? It matters profoundly, often described as the classics of these isles. The rich culture, European tradition of Celtic study, the linguistics, the archaeology, the history that is embodied. This chair has been around since the 19th century and was in danger of lapsing. We've raised £3.25 million to secure it in perpetuity. And I think that's a real testament to the college's belief in our historic connections to Wales, the Celtic tradition and literature, and to the students. So if any of you should wish to help us support this work going forward with internships, with your advice and guidance, with bursaries, we're looking to continue this outreach work, this access work. We have colleagues here from Jesus College, from our development office. Please do talk to me or my development office after this. This is literally an opportunity to ensure that what I benefited from, that many of you would have benefited from, a recognition that you are not delimited by your income, by your demographic class. It's about raw ability. Okay, that's enough of that. That's my little pitch, but it's important to us. also Brittany Wellner-Jones, our Director of Development, is sat here in table 1. Now, I'm going to tell you about the Naked Ape. The Naked Ape. Well, the Digital Ape, the Naked Ape. We took our title from that wonderful book Desmond Morris published. Does anybody remember reading The Naked Ape? Yes, there was. It was a bestseller, a real bestseller. It was a very racy book in the sense that it talked quite a lot about sex. It reminded us that we human beings are descended, we are primates. And as primates, we have biological urges and drives, and we better wake up to those urges and drives. So the Digital Ape was a bit of an homage to this great popularizer, to Desmond Morris, still going very strong in Oxford, still painting his rather lovely abstract paintings. He pointed out that the naked ape, this highly unusual and successful species, spends a lot of time examining its higher motives and an equal amount of time studiously ignoring his fundamental ones. And actually, he got away with a fantastic... On the first page of The Naked Ape, he says, quote, "He's proud that he has the biggest brain of all the primates, but attempts to conceal the fact that he has the biggest penis, preferring to accord this honor falsely to the mighty gorilla." Now, what a way to start a book. We start... But it got people interested in this whole notion of what is this balance between our biology and our character, our essence. And in the book that... Roger Hampson and I have written, The Digital Ape, we're saying the new thing that needs to be stripped bare, laid naked, is not just our biological inheritance, but it's our technological entanglement with a class of machines that are almost miraculous to us. Okay? And to make this point, we start in the book a long way back. We make the point, actually, that we think technology is new. Okay? Technology isn't new. We've been making tools to change the world since ever we were actually here as Homo sapiens. One of our dim and distant ancestors, Australopithecus afarensis, 3.5 million years ago was making and shaping flints. Right? If you think about that, for 300,000 generations before even human beings emerged, we were busy shaping tools. And they have done studies on the neurological structures that are involved when you make these tools. And you can image the brain, and you can see those areas of the brain that light up. And as you try and make more and more complex tools, the different areas of the brain are recruited. There is a view that literally we didn't just make our technology made us. That our ability to oppose our thumbs, fine motor control, coordination, planning to make our axes, finding where the raw materials are, were drivers on everything from our language to our fine motor control. Okay, so that happened 3.5 million years ago, has been happening. Taming fire allowed us to externalize digestion, made us able to derive large amounts of calories to feed the fuel-hungry brain. So we are creatures that have been technologically shaped. But what has happened in the last little while is a remarkable acceleration. And some of you may have heard of the so-called Moore's Law. This is this extraordinary fact that what is the hand axe, the stone tool of the modern age? Okay? I hold before you the supercomputer that we all carry around with us, or many of us. There's a big difference, of course, between this object and the hand axe that our forebears would have made. You and I, not even Tim Berners-Lee, can make an iPhone, okay? This is a product of an extraordinary interlinking of technologies and capabilities, tens and hundreds of thousands of person-years of ingenuity, and no person on the planet can make one of these from scratch, which is an extraordinary thing to reflect on about that interdependency. But nevertheless, the objects that these represent are now objects of extraordinary complexity. And to give you a sense of this, one fact from Moore's Law, I'll take it from my own narrative. In 1978, when I began my PhD in the Department of Artificial Intelligence, there was one then in 1978 at the University of Edinburgh, the chips of the time, the Motorola 68000 had 6,800 transistors on it. Precisely 40 years later, the chip running in this has about, this isn't the latest iPhone, this is the one before the latest one, has 6.8 billion transistors. That is 1 million times more powerful computer than the one I had to do my PhD in AI on 40 years ago. What does 1 million times increase in power give you? A world in which this phone can recognize my face and understand my voice and connect me to a world of information, track me, recommend to me, do things that are quite extraordinary, both to educate and possibly subjugate, oppress and empower. How do we strike that new deal? And that is what I want to talk about today, because the products running on this iPhone, many of them were the dreams of artificial intelligence researchers 40 years ago. When I began, the notion that you could have a computer that was good enough to recognize connected speech from just about anybody in this room, turn it into a retrieval request to a worldwide encyclopedia would have been fanciful. Okay. And yet we have this now. In fact, I suspect, had we thought about that as a capability, we would have thought perhaps the machine's really going to be self-aware and smart and wake up and oppress us. A lot of us take our image of AI from Hollywood. Right? The Hollywood, of course, the robots are generally mad, bad, and very dangerous to know. They're occasionally, they're occasionally nice and cuddly, but usually they're pretty grim. And that kind of notion of the Terminator, the weaponization of artificial intelligence, that's a very real concern, and I'll talk about that a little bit this evening. So let's get on to what's the truth and what's the myth and fiction behind artificial intelligence? Well, despite what you're told and what you might read about, the robots aren't going to wake up anytime soon. There's nobody at home in these circuits. We have not the faintest idea of what constitutes consciousness, self-awareness, reflective intelligence. We have a bunch of idiosavants, of completely customized, brilliant, task-achieving programs, from face recognition to voice recognition, but it doesn't join up. It doesn't make a connected whole. Your 4-year-old has more developed emotional self-awareness than these machines will have for, I would say, decades, centuries. We are not going to unlock that puzzle by simply increasing the speed of our processors. That isn't to say that I don't believe that ultimately the human condition cannot be understood and in some sense better appreciated, but we're a long way from that. Neither are they going to take all of your jobs, despite what you will hear. Okay, and I'll come back to that. But what is happening? What is the reality of artificial intelligence? It's occasionally we have a moment of anxiety and paranoia, and it's usually featuring a world-class human expert with their heads in their hands. And I take you back to 1997, when Garry Kasparov, the world's strongest chess player, was defeated by a program. Now, I will also take you back to the fact that about 15 years before that, my professor of artificial intelligence at the time, a great late man by the name of Professor Donald Meeke, assured me that no machine would ever beat a human world chess champion within my lifetime. So don't believe anything a professor of AI tells you about what might not happen. But that was a remarkable fact. The remarkable fact there was, again, Moore's law. Doubling the power of the computing processors meant that the deep blue supercomputer that beat Kasparov, and by the way, it was a supercomputer, was able to look up hundreds of millions of game positions a second and work out how good they would be. And here's a fact about chess. Chess has a branching factor of about 32 in the mid-game. That means that for any position you're in the middle of a game of chess, you have about 32 things you could do legally, moves. And so is your opponent. And if you take 4 moves ahead and 4 moves back, 8 moves in the game tree, that's about 650 billion possible moves. Right, that's a lot of moves. But computing power becomes so extraordinarily available that the ability to look at all of these possible moves and apply what were called heuristics or judgments about what was a more or less stronger move gave this overwhelming capability to this machine. And Kasparov famously said, I played a lot of computers, but I could smell a new kind of intelligence across the table. There was nobody at home in those circuits. Deep Blue wasn't chuffed to bits when it beat Kasparov in the World Championship and didn't get to spend the prize money either. But Kasparov thought there was, and he writes very well about this. He was unnerved, literally unnerved by an ascription to the machine that didn't accord with how the machine was playing chess. It felt intelligent, but it wasn't intelligence in the way that we know it, Jim. And that's the kind of question to reflect on. When these things are waved in front of you, ask yourself, when Alexa's chatting to you in the privacy of your home, there is nobody at home in the circuits. What there is Amazon listening about all of your interests and desires and logging your transactions. We'll come back to that. So wind forward to 2018, and there is someone else with their heads in their hands. It's Lee Sedol, the world's strongest Go player. Now, Go was claimed to be a game that was beyond the complexity of chess. That has about 250 branching factor, 250 positions you can potentially make in the big game. That means there are more Go positions than there are atoms in the universe. It's a crazy kind of concept, but they're just huge numbers. Nevertheless, AlphaGo, a product of a British-based AI company acquired by Google, defeated the world's strongest Go player. Again, the way it did that, and we can talk about that briefly, is really interesting. What we have seen is the development of supercomputing capability with insights to learn the patterns that can lie in the heart of a game like Go or chess. Now, in the meantime, in the 40 years that I've been working in AI, there have been many false dawns. And on about a cycle of about every 10 years, the robots are going to take all your jobs. And there's a fantastic series of front covers of the German magazine Der Spiegel from about 1963. The robots are coming to take your jobs. 10 years later, the robots are really coming to take your jobs. And of course, what happens is that there are robots introduced into industrial manufacturing, and there are more jobs. And people assure us that robots are going to take all your jobs. Human beings are deeply ingenious at finding out new ways to pay us to do interesting things. There are classes of employment that would have been barely credible just a few years ago. I will give you the reality game contestant. I'll give you everything from a search engine optimizer. There are jobs in our digital world. There are jobs in caring, in leisure, in social services, additional paralegal, paramedical, real legal, real medical. We will create a world of jobs. And the initial hyperbole about all those truck drivers losing their jobs when we finally get round to actually introducing driverless cars, so it will turn out to be a bit more difficult than we think, right? It's generally the case that while some jobs disappear or translocated, more jobs are created. There is an interesting reason for that, of course, that whatever our robots produce on our automated production lines have to be bought by somebody that have actually money in their pocket. So the format of giving ourselves things to do which are rewarded or paid for is a compelling one. It's also the case that new professions we haven't thought of yet will be born. Actually, some of them that we have thought of and are brilliantly prevalent. Apparently, there are lots of lawyers in this room, so I won't be rude to lawyers. But lawyers have been told that they're all going to be out of a job and paralegal jobs will disappear. There will be whole new classes of legal enterprise that's actually based around decisions around the legal entitlements and rights and decisions that algorithms are making. There'll be whole new forms of accountancy based on how you audit whether a data set is fit for use or whether the decision made by an automated process is fair or equitable. So don't worry about the jobs. In fact, if the Americans did the reasonable thing of just taking a reasonable amount of holiday, all right, they take 2 weeks a year or something absurd, they'd need about 20 million new jobs just like that. But of course, you can't always rely on our American cousins doing the reasonable thing. You can't rely on us doing the reasonable thing all of the time either. So although we are a reflective species, Homo sapiens, man the thinker, man meant man and women then, of course, Homo sapiens, we are challenged very often when it comes to doing the obviously smart thing. And I have often said, it's not artificial intelligence you need to worry about, it's natural stupidity. It's actually the fact that often we make bad choices about what we choose to do with these powerful computers, the jobs we give them to do, the decisions we ask them to take and make. And an obvious example of that confronts us immediately at the moment is the so-called weaponization of artificial intelligence. Now, we shouldn't be surprised, because if you go back to the 19th century, one of the great breakthroughs in our science and technology of the 19th century was, of course, the chemical industry. And what did they do with the chemical industry, apart from making dyes and wonderful things and fertilizers? They made mustard gas and phosgene. They weaponized the chemical industry. Biological sciences, the understanding of the biological world around us, what have we done with that science and technology? We weaponized it. Nuclear science and technology, weaponized it. AI, we will weaponize it. The question will be whether we are smart enough, as we have done with other types of technology, to think about the regulations, the rules, the restraints, the non-proliferation, the conventions we might need to adapt so that we don't find ourselves with swarms of killer drones with no human in the kill chain. That's stark language, but it's something that we have to genuinely take on board and think about. So if I look back again on the history of artificial intelligence from my first involvement, I've talked about these cycles of enthusiasm, and I think it's important to go back and realize that, again, artificial intelligence isn't one thing. It is a toolbox of methods, many of them routinely deployed now, many of them described for marketing purpose as artificial intelligence, a version, for company X, Y, and Z. Today's artificial intelligence is tomorrow's computer science. A great deal of what is advertised as artificial intelligence is statistics 101. And it's important to recognize that. When we go back to the 1980s, when I first began my group at Nottingham in the Department of Psychology there, we were very seized with a particular way of building AI systems. It was called expert systems. It was called knowledge-based systems. The reason I was in the Department of Psychology was that the approach to building AI then was to try and emulate human beings, knowledgeable experts. Hence the name of the field. And what you would do is you'd talk to experts, look at their textbooks, you'd interview them, you'd get them to do a whole variety of tasks, and you'd try and take the essence of their knowledge and build a computer program to do that task. Very successful, lots of expert systems built. One of my first commercial startups was a company which could take a diagram that a chemical engineer would produce, a so-called flow sheet, and produce a three-dimensional layout. Very elegant, was acquired by an American company. The point about that system was that we had to get the knowledge the chemical engineer had in terms of how you positioned elements, how you read this logical specification, how you laid it out in 3 dimensions. And along the way, we learned something very salutary. Lots of knowledge in experts' heads is implicit, is common sense, isn't in the books. So when we would look at our designs, we'd sort of ask ourselves, well, a human chemical engineer puts a tank here and a feeder down here, another tank down here, and there's no pump in the way, because he knows he can get the liquid from here to there using what? Gravity. There is nothing in the specification that says you can leave the pump out because gravity will take care of it. It's common sense. Line after line, example after example in our systems showed the sheer application of common engineering sense, common medical sense. And you don't find that in all the cases that are loaded into our modern machine learning techniques either. So there is a huge amount that is still to be elicited, understood, and coded. But those efforts have led to systems in everything from medicine and diagnosis to engine control to predictive maintenance. It was the beginning of attempts to do what is now routine at Rolls-Royce, where they're so aware of the engineer's knowledge that they can anticipate the mean time to failure of a component so that it's replaced before it fails, not when it fails. And this whole revolution in manufacturing has been important. Another thing we did in the 1990s was wake up to this emerging new thing called the web, the internet. Now, before Tim Berners-Lee got on and built it, there was an internet. You may remember it, things like America Online. There were all these ways of connecting information. It was a real pain because although we built email and messaging services, we couldn't connect documents very easily. Tim's genius was to take this world of isolated systems and to layer on top a thing called the World Wide Web protocols. This was a very thin shim of clever engineering that allowed suddenly a world of documents to be connected, the hyperlinks that we see and live with now. And what Tim and I did from the 2000 onwards was to try and build what we called the Semantic Web. And this is where you take the content of all those billions of web pages and try and put a little knowledge into the pages behind the web browsers. This is very much ongoing work. It's been very exciting. Again, very much based on the idea that when you go to a web page, you can understand that it has a particular structure, whether it's the page for a hotel or a business or a conference. It will have distinctive items that you can characterize. And you can build some of that meaning into the markup language of the web itself. This idea has been taken by companies like Google and built at huge scale, their so-called knowledge graph that allows them to pull information together at web scale using the standards of the web. There is plenty of AI methodology out there which you wouldn't recognize as even being AI techniques in the modern sense. And if any of you saw IBM, again, IBM's rather clever Watson system, that's the system that can play this game, this quiz game in the US called Jeopardy. It seems to do extremely well at answering these general knowledge questions, but it's drawing on the web at scale containing huge amounts of encyclopedic information. If you think about Wikipedia, how many times do you look something up online to answer a question you might have? How many times do you go to a resource online to answer your queries? And that's, again, allowed for a huge explosion of new methods and techniques. It's what allows Siri, for example, when I ask the question, tell me when Leonardo da Vinci was born, to answer the question. It's got to recognize the text, convert that into a query, but then it's got a knowledge base to go and ask that question of. So we built quite remarkable resources. And what we're building most recently is a new kind of rather challenging to some people AI method. So I've talked about the expert systems and the semantic web. The most recent development is the so-called neural network. Now, again, in the 1990s, I was working with colleagues on what was called biologically inspired robotics. This was the idea that can we imagine programming our computers and our robots in the same way that we are connected and wired up? Our own nervous systems are these exquisite network structures of synapses and axons and neurons. And a child, as they learn to make their way through the world, is carving out connections between the neurons in their brain, pathways. In fact, it never stops. Even in later life, if you suffer a stroke or an injury, if you are engaged in certain sorts of activity, you can promote this connectivity of the brain. It's one of the reasons we're able to deal with all sorts of changes as we grow old and develop, as we literally grow through our developmental stages as young children. This is an exciting model. Imagine if you could program machines in this way. Well, that's where some of the most exciting modern developments have come, the so-called deep neural networks. The work that defeated Lee Sedol, our Go player, was based on two things. Huge compute power, which had arisen by accident, I'll come back to that, and this idea of programming as network connections. So, whilst we've been doing all this high-minded research, what have kids been doing with their time online? Playing games, okay? Lots of video games, faster and faster, more and more powerful, shoot-'em-up games, unfortunately, usually. An important part of the architecture of a game station is a thing called the GPU, the graphical processing unit. That's the thing that manipulates the screen in real time, makes very efficient calculations of whether one pixel relates to another, how to move and change the image. GPUs, general processing units, they turn out to be getting more powerful even faster than the general processing units that drive your phone. In fact, your phone contains lots of GPUs as well. It turns out that if I take a layer, a single GPU, and another GPU, and another, and another, and another, I can build a stack of these processing units that start to look a lot like the neural networks, the neural layers in a brain, an animal brain or a human brain. I can begin to connect the various units up. I achieve remarkable compute power if I do that. That is the world of modern machine learning. It's a new set of developments that allow us to solve some problems extraordinarily powerfully. One of which is face recognition. Now, here's an interesting thing about the modern face recognition that Google or the Chinese company SenseTime, which can recognize hundreds of millions of faces. I really promise you, hundreds of millions of faces can be trained to be uniquely discriminated. No human brain can do that, by the way. You recognize lots of people, but nothing on the same order. You actually learn to do it, of course, on many few less examples than the neural network's trained on. But that capability, that extraordinary capability, when we open up the network to try and understand what's happening, it's this extraordinary tangle of network connections. It's very hard to make sense of it. So here's a deep irony. We have built modern methods whose internal operations we find very hard to understand. So suppose I use one of these neural networks to drive a car, and the car crashes. And I say, well, explain to me why it was taking the decision it was taking. Well, here's the network. Then explain anything. My old rule-based systems from 1980, when it told me why it was putting this object in the chemical plant above another one, could give me a set of rules that explained the decisions it went through. So here's an interesting example where our technology needs to be made accountable and explicable. The modern world of AI is full of challenges in terms of accounting and explaining behavior. The modern world of AI is full of ethical dilemmas. In fact, possibly the fastest growing field of AI is ethics in AI. And if I'd leave you with some last thoughts on this issue, it's absolutely around the ethics. So my group at Oxford, my research group, which is doing the work in artificial intelligence, often we ask ourselves, why are we building this, okay? And can we account in a reasonable way for what's happening? So here's an interesting question. Of all the apps on your mobile phone, would you have the faintest idea of what data is being collected by which app and where's it being sent? For what purpose? And yet we have the GDPR, where we claim to be putting power of our data destinations. There's a huge gap between the experience you have in using this technology and the reality of what's happening in the data-driven economy. We think that's a really urgent thing to address, not just in terms of the data on your phones, but in terms of the data being collected in your Internet of Things, in your home hubs. Just as important about all the information you disclose that is represented in your social network or your Facebook page. You may have heard today of the report from the Select Committee, DCMS, on its view that some companies have become far too powerful in this respect. On new kinds of monopolies. Should we worry that Facebook or Google or Amazon or Apple or Baidu or Tencent, these are the Chinese equivalents, have access to huge amounts of our personal information? And how can we hold them in check? Because they are using this information and the AI algorithms I've been talking about to recommend products to us, to anticipate our desires, our intentions. This is a complex world. But this is not a world that we should give up and surrender our agency. This is a world in which we have to ask questions about the fundamental deal between us and our data. Sometimes it's described that we are the product. We are being, in some sense, dealt with as a means to an end. For those of you who remember your moral philosophy, there was a very famous moral philosopher, Immanuel Kant, a leader of the Enlightenment. Treat people as ends in themselves. Okay. It's a good maxim. There are some other very good ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. Dignity, self-determination, autonomy, privacy, tolerance. These are the ideas of an open society. I relish and cherish the technology that we have delivered in our AI research this past 50, 60 years. But it's technology that should be held accountable. The firms that develop it should be held accountable. And we should ask ourselves what new forms of regulation and convention, social norms, law we might need in this brave new world. Because it's a remarkable fact that within 10 years we will have earbuds that can more or less translate in real time French to English or English to Mandarin. That's the Babelfish of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide. Real-time translation between languages. It's an absolute fact that I will have on my iPhone of the time an app that will scan a lesion on my skin and tell me whether to go and see my dermatologist. Or look in my retina and tell me whether I've got a disease that I might want to get checked up. Or indeed record my fitness levels, my blood sugar levels, my ... Who holds that information for what purpose? How it's applied? How we balance that? And it's not enough to say, well, the Chinese will do this anyway, so we will just better get on with it ourselves. Or indeed, the company X has got all this information, it's just not worth disrupting the marketplace. We have always taken a view that the technology should serve humanity, not humanity serve the technology. Thank you very much. Thank you.